So we have a major update in the fight to dismantle the NFA's suppressor restrictions, and this case may be heading towards a decision sooner rather than later, because right now the Supreme Court has set this case to be considered at this Friday's conference. But now outside 2A groups have stepped in, filing a major amicus brief urging the court to take this case and review it. So the question is, will that be enough to get the Supreme Court's attention before this week's conference? So let's break down what is happening in this critical suppressor challenge. Now, before we jump into this video, if you want to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply by subscribing. You can also hit the like button. That just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. I also want to thank one of the main supporters of this channel, which is First Form. You guys know that First Form's an amazing company. They have a great supplements if you're trying to get healthier, if you're working out more. They have amazing apparel, but also they support the Second Amendment and what we talk about here on the channel. So if you're interested, if you want to check them out and learn more, you can do so using the links down below. And if you order any supplements, you can get a free 5-pack of protein sticks. So as I mentioned in the intro, in this video, we're talking about the US versus Peterson case, which challenges the constitutionality of the NFA as it applies to suppressors. This case started in Louisiana, where back in 2022, law enforcement officers executed a search warrant against Mr. Peterson's home and his home-based FFL. During this search, they found a single solvent trap in his bedroom safe, and based on that, he was charged with possessing an unregistered NFA item. So in response to that, Mr. Peterson, of course, challenged his charge and essentially moved to dismiss that charge, arguing that the NFA's registration and taxation scheme does in fact violate the Second Amendment. But on review, the district court rejected that motion to dismiss. This case then went to the Fifth Circuit, and at first the court said that suppressors were not protected arms at all for the purposes of the Second Amendment. But then something very critical happened. The federal government changed its position on suppressors and admitted that suppressors are in fact protected arms. That forced the Fifth Circuit to have to withdraw its original ruling, but when it issued a new ruling, they still upheld the restriction and they still upheld the NFA, just using a different theory. For the new ruling, the Fifth Circuit assumed that suppressors are protected arms, but said that the NFA survives because it operates like a shall issue licensing regime. So they tried to use Bruin to say that this is a shall issue permit. So in other words, as long as the government processes these applications objectively, the restrictions can still be constitutional according to the Fifth Circuit and currently the DOJ. Now that reasoning is very concerning because if that logic holds, it could justify regulating many protected arms under the guise that the regulation is simply a shall issue licensing scheme. So Peterson decided to take this case to the Supreme Court. In the petition, he asked two very key questions. First, can the NFA's registration and taxation system be treated like a licensing law? Second, does the NFA violate the Second Amendment as applied to suppressors? Now, here's the newest development. A coalition of pro-2A organizations, including Gun Owners of America and others, have filed an amicus brief supporting Mr. Peterson, and their arguments go directly at the core of what the Fifth Circuit said in their ruling. First, they argue that lower courts are misusing Bruin altogether. Specifically, they say that courts are relying on Bruin's shall issue language to avoid doing the required historical analysis. Instead of applying the full Second Amendment test, courts are carving out exceptions and calling regulations presumptively constitutional. Second, they argue that the NFA is not actually a true shall issue system because in practice, it involves delays, it involves discretion, and it does not function like a neutral permitting process. So according to their brief, the Fifth Circuit's entire framework and rationale is flawed and should not actually be upheld. Third, they argue that the Supreme Court has never created a presumption that firearms regulations are constitutional. In fact, under cases like Bruin and Rahimi, all firearms regulations must be tested against historical tradition, not just assumed valid just because they exist. And finally, they argue that this case is actually very straightforward because suppressors are widely owned and commonly possessed and used for lawful purposes. And under Supreme Court precedent, that alone strongly supports constitutional protections. Now, here's where things get critical for this case. The US government has already waived its right to respond to this petition, so they said to the Supreme Court and the clerks there that they're not going to file a response to this petition unless ordered to do so by the Supreme Court. But as of right now, the Supreme Court has not ordered a response. So that is a major procedural signal because in cases that the Supreme Court is at least considering, it often will request a response before conference. And in this case, the Supreme Court has already distributed this case for conference, and that's going to happen this Friday. That means that the Supreme Court justices will meet and decide what they want to do, but as of right now, no response has been ordered from the government. So what does this tell us about where this case is going? Well, right now, the case is heading to that conference, and it's going to potentially head without a response from the government, without full briefing. And right now, it's only heading to that conference with outside groups urging the court to take the case. And that creates kind of this mixed signal. On one hand, no response ordered by the court can be a bad sign, but on the other hand, these amicus briefs are giving the Supreme Court more reason to want to take a closer look at this case. So after Friday's conference, if we get no order for a response before that, there are a few possibilities that could happen. The court could simply just deny the case outright on the next order list. They could relist the case for another conference, or after that conference, request a response finally from the government and say, we kind of considered this, maybe we want you to finally file that response. Or they could simply grant review, but that's highly unlikely in my opinion. I think realistically, without a response being ordered, there's a higher chance of a denial, or at least after that conference, finally there would be an order for the DOJ and the federal government to finally file that response. So this case matters because it goes far beyond suppressors. If the Fifth Circuit's reasoning stands, it could allow the government to regulate protected arms simply by calling it a shall issue licensing system. And that could extend to other things like rifles, handguns, magazines, and other types of firearms regulations. So that's why this case is so critical. So the Peterson case is now at a critical moment of review. And now it all comes down to, what does the Supreme Court do next? Are they going to request anything before the conference, or what are they going to do after that conference? So that's where this critical suppressor challenge that's in front of the Supreme Court currently stands. As soon as we get more information, as soon as we hear anything from the court, I will let you guys know. If you like this video and you would like to support the channel, one of the best ways to do that is simply to like, comment, and subscribe. All of those things help to fuel the algorithm and just tells the algorithm that you appreciate this content, and so it shares it with more people. But as always, thank you so much for all of your support. And never forget, this nation was built by armed scholars, and this nation will be maintained by armed scholars.